it's safe to say that this progression is my personal favorite out of all 10, both as a composition and from a technical perspective. Here we're building on a number of concepts we've already introduced, and also bringing in a few new things. We have some seriously extended arpeggio patterns, and they use open notes and slides to get us up to increasingly higher positions. We're using more seventh chords now, including the dominant seventh, using a seventh with the root minor chord, and even changing that to the major version of the root chord with a seventh. We again have that borrowed diminished chord from the key a fifth above, only this time it's a half diminished, which we'll talk more about when we get there. This progression also introduces the idea of using open notes to give the fretting hand time to make a drastic position shift. The implied bass line becomes a bit less of an actual bass line, but it still manages to set out a clear rhythm with melodic anchors for the progression as a whole. For the first part, we have an extended E minor arpeggio, starting with the low E on the open sixth string, similarly to the one found in the E minor from exercise 29. This time, however, we slide from the 3rd fret up to the 7th fret, use a rolling bar to continue on the 7th fret of the 5th string, hammer on the 10th fret, and then shift the first finger up to the 9th fret to slide all the way up to the 14th fret. From this point, we continue up the top 4 strings of the standard minor sweep pattern. You should be quite familiar with it at this point, ending with a hammer-on the 19th fret. In one short measure, we make our way up through the E minor arpeggio from the open 6th string to the 19th fret on the 1st string, making this the most extended pattern we've seen in this course so far. This next pattern starts in a pretty unusual way. Because we need to jump down from the 15th position now from where we left off in the last pattern to the 6th position, also jumping down from the 1st string to the 6th string in that process. In order to make this doable, we'll play the open A on the 5th string instead of trying to play the A on the 5th fret of the 6th string with the first finger. This type of transition is pretty awkward at first, and it's also counterintuitive because of how we're playing a lower note on a higher string, the open A on the 5th string, before going to a lower string to play a higher note, the B on the 7th fret of the 6th string. But it's just going to take a bit of extra practice to get comfortable with it. The key to getting this down is to practice the position shift with the metronome as a simultaneous motion with the playing of the open string. The fact that we're starting on the 5th string before going to the 6th string and then sweeping down all 6 strings back to the 1st string in order helps with the transition, since it allows for an upward sweep motion before starting the downward sweep on the way back. At the end of the pattern, we slide down with the first finger to the 5th fret of the 1st string, which will set us up for the next pattern. For the next part, we have another E minor arpeggio, only this time it's an entirely different pattern which ascends and slides up with the 2nd finger to get us to 7th position, before it descends 3 strings, jumps to the 1st string, and descends again. Only this time it's an entirely different pattern, ascending and sliding up with the 2nd finger to get us to 7th position, before it descends 3 strings, jumps up to the 1st string, and descends again. The transition from the previous section to this one is also pretty challenging, and it causes us to have to skip over 5 strings this time. I've written the fingering as starting with the 3rd finger on the 7th fret of the 6th string to the 4th finger on the 7th fret of the 6th string. This is to avoid having to use a rolling bar with the 4th finger. However, if you're comfortable with using your 4th finger for both, that would be more efficient. Now we have the pattern that goes from E minor 7 to E7, briefly changing our root chord from minor to major, similarly to how we did previously in the course. We're also starting this part with a tapped note on the 15th fret of the 1st string. Tapping a note like this is a common method of extending the range of a sweep pattern, which is exactly one of the things that it's doing here. But it can also be used to free up the fretting hand for a dramatic position shift, in a similar way to how we use the open string at the start of exercise 47. This time we have a descending pattern for E minor 7, which then jumps back up a short distance to start a descending pattern for the E7. Pay attention to how the first note of each of these arpeggios functions similarly to the bass notes of our implied rhythm, at least rhythmically. And that's despite the fact that they're the highest note of each pattern instead of the lowest. This time, we have a 4-string pattern of A minor that uses a slide to change positions and a tap note towards the end to extend the range. Now we have a C-sharp half-diminished arpeggio, also known as a C-sharp minor flat 5 on 5 strings. The half-diminished chord uses a minor 7th instead of the double flat 7th found in a diminished 7th chord. This way, a half-diminished chord actually fits into natural minor, whereas the diminished 7th does not, usually being used instead in harmonic or melodic minor. The fact that this is a C-sharp half-diminished arpeggio uses the same concept as the borrowed diminished 7th arpeggios we've used previously. C-sharp diminished is the diminished chord that naturally occurs in the key of B minor, which, like previously, is a fifth higher than the key of E minor, our root. Previously, we used the diminished 7th from harmonic minor, while now this half-diminished arpeggio fits into the natural B minor scale. However, in the case of a half-diminished chord, borrowed from the minor key a fifth from the root of the key that we're in, we can simplify things by merely seeing it as another diminished chord that occurs in the melodic minor scale of our root key. And that's because the only note that steps outside of our root key is the sharp sixth. The half-diminished arpeggio has a sound to it that's more reminiscent of the classical and romantic periods of classical music, and can add incredible depth to a neoclassical progression when used well. In my opinion, it's criminally underutilized in the neoclassical style and deserves a lot more attention from neoclassical guitarists. The ever-popular diminished 7th arpeggio is obviously amazing and incredibly versatile. It has a very clear, cutting, and dark sound to it, although its emotional content is fairly simplistic. This combination makes it generally compatible and likewise pretty easy to utilize. On the other hand, the emotional content of the half-diminished chord is much more complex, and this creates the potential for it to be used to create much more interesting and deeper music. But then, as you'd expect, it's also significantly more difficult to utilize, and far less generally compatible than the diminished 7th. This is obviously enough to explain why it's used so infrequently in neoclassical, at least compared to the diminished 7th. But I hope the use of it in this progression will be enough to at least spark your interest in it as a chord for neoclassical. That is, if it's not something you've worked with before. For the next section, we're back to the B7 arpeggio. It starts with that other standard type of 5-string suite pattern we talked about, based on a 5th-string root note bar chord. We use a rolling bar with the 2nd finger on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. As we've now done several times, instead of the usual hammer-on you'd find on the 1st string, we're sliding up to 17th position with our 1st finger, and this both sets us up for the rest of this section, as well as for the next section. Here we actually go all the way up to the 23rd fret with the 4th finger, and then pull off down to the 17th fret. Note-wise, that's quite a jump, but it's not too bad considering the smaller fret spacing at the higher position of the fretboard. You could use tapping for the 23rd fret if you'd prefer, both for this part and the next. I found it to be more natural to use the 4th finger with a pull-off, but in this case, I think it comes down to personal preference. For the last section of progression 6, we go from an F-sharp diminished 7th arpeggio back to the B7 arpeggio. Note that we're again resolving one of the two tritones of the diminished 7th by switching to the dominant 7th of the same harmonic minor scale. Here we play the 23rd fret with the 4th finger using a down pick, before up-picking the 20th fret with the 2nd finger and pulling off to the 17th fret with the 1st finger. This is unusual for a couple reasons. Up until now, we've mostly been using some kind of legato technique when playing multiple notes on the same string. In this case, using a pull-off for such a large reach is a bit awkward, and so instead we're using the 1st and 2nd notes as a time to adjust picking direction from the end of the previous exercise. Just like I mentioned in the previous exercise, if you'd prefer, you could just as easily tap the 23rd fret and then adjust the fingering on the following notes to something easier than we have it here. In this progression, you'll notice that those transitions from one part to the next prove a considerable challenge compared to the previous progressions. Make sure to spend as much time as you need to get those transitions as comfortable as the rest of the sections.